It is the case that in most large-scale institutions, a small number of people do almost all the productive work, right? That's the square root law. Okay, so if you have 10,000 employees, 100 of them are doing half the work. Now, we saw a stellar example of that in Musk's takeover of Twitter, because he dispensed with about 80% of the employees, and all he did was improve the company. Now, Musk has had extensive experience doing that sort of thing with other companies, and he's obviously able to separate the wheat from the chaff.
So there's something we have going for us here, is that I don't have to start in a vacuum. There is this thing we call the US Constitution, already proven, time-tested, to be the best operating manual for a nation and preserving liberty and human history. That's certainly my view. Well, it turns out that much of the excess we have seen came from running afoul of that operating document. So many of the administrative agencies that were created in a manner that Congress actually never gave those agencies the power to wield the power that they do. The Supreme Court has, in the last 2 years, already begun to recognize that. West Virginia versus EPA, a case where the Supreme Court held that the EPA's regulation, climate-focused regulations on the coal industry, were unconstitutional because we, the people, never gave the government that authority, and Congress, in turn, never gave that authority to this three-letter agency, which nonetheless ran afoul. Well, if those EPA regulations are unconstitutional, then it turns out most of the federal regulations today are also unconstitutional. Turns out most of the employees implementing those regulations are actually unnecessary. So in many ways, I don't think we have to start in some first principles whiteboard of a vacuum and say, how are we going to design and draw this up? That would be a fatal conceit, I think. That would be hubris, I think, designed for failure, to think that one man, Elon Musk or myself or anybody else, is just not going to happen. It's destined for failure. But if you're following a time-tested framework for the operating manual for this nation, an operating manual built in the shadow of the Declaration of Independence, the greatest mission statement for a free society in human history, well, then I think we actually are doing nothing more than implementing that which is already time-tested and true. And so, I don't want to, short sell myself here on, I'm 37 years old. I've built multiple multi-billion-dollar companies. I do understand that if somebody works for you and you can't fire them, that means they don't work for you. I understand what meritocratic hiring looks like. You work for them. You're in some ways their slave, because you're responsible for what they do without any authority to change it. So I understand these principles, but it's not that experience-based, not Donald Trump's, not Musk's, not mine, that could be sufficient to get this right at the level of the nation. It is actually a firm understanding and commitment to the Constitution itself. And that brings me back to that rare combination. You can't rely on your advisors for that. That is not a substitute for saying, okay, I'm bringing executive experience and then I'm going to ask my advisors how it's done within this legal framework and ask the lawyers. And I think that's the difference between me and Trump. And I think that'd be the difference between me or someone like an Elon Musk or anybody else who is great as a business builder and is a good alternative to the professional political class doing this in Washington, D.C. But I think it requires a deep intellectual, historical, principled understanding, passion for, and commitment to that Constitution to see that through, but not doing it as somebody who's coming in as just a law professor or a lawyer. They're not going to have the skill set to actually, the fortitude to cut and see that through. And that explains why we haven't had leaders to that effect yet, because that is a rare combination. Those skill sets aren't supposed to go together, right? These are different skill sets for a reason.
Why do they go together in your case?
I hope they do.
But why do you think they do? What is it about your background and your interests that make it reasonable for you to make the claim that you exist at that intersection between, like, legal prowess, let's say, and wisdom in relationship to the Constitution, and that entrepreneurial bent? What do you have on that front that, say, Trump doesn't have?
Yeah, so the first thing I'll say is, I'm not going to claim to be some messiah coming from on high with exactly the prescription. But what called me into this race, when you and I first started getting to know each other, I would have said we were both nuts if we were thinking about me running for US president. I was driving change in the private sector. I started Strive. I was writing books. That was my calling. So the thing that pulled me in, Dr. Peterson, is that I think I am the best among the lot we have now to actually bring that combination to the White House at a moment where we require it, to actually reform that administrative state, to gut and bring a revolution to that administrative state that we need a unique combination to actually achieve. Because I watched where Trump fell short. I watched where Trump excelled above his lot. And so that pulled me in. So I will preface everything I'm saying by saying that I'm not going to tell you that I am some messiah and here I have arrived, okay? Far from it. But I do think I'm a product of my experiences. So first of all, I had the privilege of not growing up in money. I had the privilege of actually having to work for what I've achieved. I'm grateful for that. I did not want to be burdened, as many of my peers at places like Harvard and Yale were burdened, and I do think it's a burden, by the burden of inheritance or by the burden of not having the space to actually achieve and ordain for myself what I would in my career.